Welcome to This Week in Washington for September the 16th, 2011. This has been a very busy week in Washington concerning public transit issues that affect all of those who provide public transportation services across the country. Many of these issues have circled around the Jobs Bill and on the safety reauthorization and the extension that was being worked on throughout this week here in the Capitol. Many of these events are covered in detail on our website, and they are also covered in fast mail, so I hope you've had a chance to review them throughout this week. On the Jobs Bill, as you know from our information, the President has proposed setting aside an $8 billion investment in public transportation, similar to the situation that was used in the last bill on the stimulus. This bill will also include a 10% set aside for operating assistance, which, although the percentage sounds small, does come to almost $800 million to help transit systems meet operating costs. That's the good news about the bill. The bad news about the bill is the President also released how this bill would be paid for. The majority of effort to pay for this bill does involve changing the tax rates for the wealthiest Americans, something that Congress has been unwilling to do for at least the last 4 years. And if you have followed the debate so far on the Jobs Bill, you've seen that the Republicans, at least yesterday, staked out their positions as opposed to any tax changes. It's not possible for me to see how we arrive at the additional money that would be spent for highways and transportation without a form of revenue or explaining how this would be paid for. In addition to the issues that were created around the Jobs Bill, Congress moved this week to pass an extension that would take Safety Lou forward for another 6 months. That looks like it will clear the Congress today, and the authorization will continue. Unfortunately, the authorization does nothing to provide for increased revenue for the Highway and Transportation Trust Fund. It just allows it to continue to exist and to continue to be used to support public transit as well as the highway program. The problem this creates for us is the trust fund remains 30% behind the current expenditure levels. The House of Representatives has approved a bill that in theory would allow the current programs to continue in the appropriations process, but that amount being appropriated would reflect this 30% reduction. Consequently, we could be faced with a 30% reduction in transportation funding within the next fiscal year that starts on October 1st. Our problem is, if we can't find that additional revenue with the work of the Senate, it's hard to imagine any revenue enhancements coming up that would look or be favored by the Republicans, especially in the House of Representatives. One of the difficult tasks I think that we could be facing, besides these terrible outcomes on not being able to get additional revenue through a jobs bill or the inability to maintain the current level of funding, is what do we do and where do we stand should we have to face a 30% reduction in the transit program? So far, we've managed to avoid that discussion, but I think it's important that you consider how we would consider handling this here in Washington. I'm not sure that we would favor a 30% across the board cut in all aspects of the public transit program. I think that we might want to be advocates for giving a priority to maintaining the formula programs first and cutting other things second. In that respect, we could stand and say, hey, we're for maintaining the programs that are funded in the formula. On the 30% transit reduction, take it out of the other programs or options within the transit budget or in the FTA budget to meet that obligation. Basically, we'd ask Congress to minimize the impact on the formula program. Some people favor this, again, some people don't. I think we're going to be faced with trying to make up our minds what should be our priority in that respect. And I'd like you to think about that in the next several days and kind of let me know what your thinking is. I'd like to know if you favor maintaining the formulas first as the primary effort that we would make with Congress should this 30% reduction go in, or are there other programs that we would favor changing and or even eliminating at the expense of not allowing such a huge reduction? Looking beyond the current several months, I think we are faced with another series of issues of deciding how we carry on the need or how we deal with such a massive reduction in transportation investment at the federal level. Obviously, the efforts, especially in our rural programs, to expand coverage would be severely impacted by these decisions, as would the current services. I think there may be some options that we would have to look to in terms of perhaps a greater involvement in private sector financing, some of the work that we've done the last several years in our loan and financing programs to help fill these gaps. Perhaps that might be one of the ways we look at trying to address the problems that are created on capital. It could well be that our continued efforts on Medicare and Medicaid would have to be dramatically expanded to try to get some additional help for our members under these situations. All of that will be things that we'll have to approach after we know a little bit more about this situation. But in the meantime, I'd like you to give me some ideas about how you think we should deal with a 30% reduction. And again, whether you favor something like Formula First or that we have an across-the-board cut in all aspects of the program. I'm looking for that kind of input. I wish I had better news today. You know, the news situation in Washington always changes. That the things that look the darkest today may not be so bad tomorrow. It could be next week may bring us a different kind of awareness or a different kind of thinking about some of these issues. But in the meantime, that's what's going on. So I'd be glad to hear from you again about any ideas. I hope that you had a good week this week and that next week will be a good week for you as well. Thank you and stay in touch. I'll be back in touch with you shortly. Have a great weekend. Goodbye.